This conference will now be recorded.
And also to the people who are attending online. So this is our first session after the introduction we have had this morning. First session of this network school, which is going to be presented by Dr. Sonal Choudhary. She's a senior lecturer in sustainable management at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and also the head of the Operations Management and Decision Sciences Research Center at Sheffield University Management School. Sonal has got a very extensive research experience in the agri-food supply chain. She's leading major research projects at the moment with a lot of field work, working with farmers, processors, producers, any stakeholder from the supply chain. So we thought that the best opening session for this network school was one delivered by Sonal about best practices for delivering research, for conducting research in the agri-food supply chain based on her recent experience. So over to you, Sonal. We've got 1.5 hours, and I think there will be also many questions towards the end of your presentation. So feel free to start now. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, thanks Andrea for the generous introduction, and hello everyone there. So I would really like to apologize because just yesterday I realized that I was giving a presentation on best practices in agri-food supply chain research. So I had prepared the presentation in best practices in agri-food supply chain, but nevertheless I think we should be covering the research and the different methods that are used mostly in my research, not necessarily.
Sonal, I think there is a problem with your microphone because it went, the volume went suddenly down.
I'm on a very high volume here.
No, yeah, now it's okay. Now it's okay. Go on.
Okay. All right. Okay. Right, guys. So you're able to hear me now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the best practices in agri-food supply chain research. And sorry, I would be coughing in between because I'm still recovering. Okay, so in this presentation, I would be covering agri-food supply chain and overview, and I'm sure like many of you already know agri-food supply chain and how it functions. Then understanding the context, why it is important when we are doing the research, different research approaches and methods, and that would be in a very brief sense. Finally, an in-depth agri-food research project example, and towards the end, key aspects of working with agri-food supply chain partners. So when you are going and for your secondments with the different organization, what are the key aspects that you should be taking care of? Okay, so as we all understand, in general context, if we try and understand a supply chain, an agri-food supply chain, you would generally start at the farm level. So farmer. Then there are processors. Sometimes processors are replaced by pack houses or the collection centers, which are the aggregators at the farm level. And then there are distributors. Finally, warehouses. Sometimes there are no warehouses. It depends where your research is based, and there could be open market yards instead of warehouses. And then the retailers and the final consumers. So these are different processes. They are different activities within these different processes. There are different actors, the stakeholders that are involved in any of these processes and the activities. So it's a very, very multi-stakeholder approach that we should be taking when we are trying to understand the agri-food supply chain. Now, each stakeholder and the processes would have different challenges and vulnerabilities. Challenges are worse when the supply chain is multi-tier and long. And nowadays, we do have quite long and multi-tier supply chain. Yeah, so it's not just about supply chain is more than just a flow of material. So it's not just a good that is flowing from the farm to the end of the consumers, but it's also about the information. And when we talk about the material flow, mostly you would see the material flow from the left hand side. My left hand side, I think it would be your left hand side as well. So from upstream to the downstream, that would be the material flow direction. Information flow, most of the time, it should be both ways. The information should be flowing from upstream to downstream and from downstream to upstream. But many of the times, they are broken. So how do we deal with that? We would be covering that aspect as well. And cash flow, which happens from the downstream, from the consumer end to the upstream level. So it's much more than just a simple movement of the goods. Yeah. And in reality, it's not so straight line supply chain, but it is quite complex and very much multi-layered. So there would be different farms. Sometimes different farms would form co-ops. They would aggregate their products together. Then the transportation would happen through different wagons. Sometimes these closed wagons are very much in the different countries. There could be bicycles, motorbikes, carts, open trucks, and then it could go to either processors or pack houses, as we call it in India and many countries in Africa. And then again, transportation happens. There are distribution centers. Sometimes there is a central distribution center. Sometimes they have decentralized distribution center, and then the different retail outlets. Now, the retail outlets, again, it could be closed room retail outlet or supermarkets or open carts like we have in many of the countries in Asia and Africa. Okay, and then it goes to the consumers. Sometimes we do have hub and spoke model as well. So again, different farms would concentrate their products at one stage, and then it goes to the decentralized collection center. From the collection center, it goes to the main distribution center, and then from there, it could go to the different retails or direct to the consumers as well. It depends which kind of industry we are talking about, hospitality industry or direct consumption to the consumers. Okay, now I'm going to share some current research practices and the key challenges related to agri-food supply chain research. Now, understanding the context where the research is based, it is very, very important before we start our research. Yeah, so understanding the context, such as what's the scope of the research. For example, if our research is on, let's say, resilient supply chain, now how do we define resilience? Yeah, so there could be three notions of defining resilience. One, it is robustness. So it has to be robust, meaning that it has to resist the disruption to the current outcome. Second, recovery process. So it has to return to current outcome after disruption. Third, reorientation. So it has to have some alternative outcome after disruption. Therefore, there is a transformation that is needed there. And if you involve all these three, it is mostly the reorganization that we are talking about. So it's making the changes to the system. So we are talking about the adaptation. Okay. So again, understanding the definition, the scope, the topic first. It should be the first priority. And when we talk about the resilient supply chain, and let's say if we are taking a systems approach, now again, we try and define the food system resilience. So the four main questions that we should be asking is resilience of what, resilience to what, resilience for whom, and over what time period. Now, I'm going to give you some example, which has been taken from European Journal of Operations Research, as well as John Ingram from Oxford University. So resilience of what? So if we are looking into a food systems approach, so resilience of food system activities to deliver outcomes. Now the outcomes, one of the main outcome when we are, especially in today's world, when we are doing the food supply chain research or the agri-food supply chain research, we have to consider the food security aspect. Yeah, and the food security generally, when it is defined, especially by FAO, it is the food utilization, food access, and food availability. Now, this sits in the context of social and environmental parameters. So we are not just here talking in terms of the cost effectiveness of the supply chain, but more than the cost or the economic bottom line of the supply chain, we have to also consider the social outcomes and the environmental outcomes, because we are in today's world, we are operating in changing climate where water is limited. Most of the resources are actually very much limited, especially the water and soil fertility. Then there is a biodiversity issue. We are degrading the biodiversity. The geochemistry, the soil chemistry is completely different. And in terms of the social welfare, again, we have to understand like how it is impacting the livelihood, not just for the farmers' livelihood, but also the different traders and the different laborers in the supply chain. Employment generation, health aspect, and it is very important, especially given the agri-food supply chain context. Health is directly related to the food security and as well as food safety aspect. So the nutritional aspect and the food safety aspect, again, it's very important. Social capital, political capital, ethics. So again, understanding the resilience in terms of what outcomes we want from the system, what metrics we are working for, is again a very important aspect to start with. And given the context of ProCEedS, again, when we talk about the circularity, we should be also thinking in terms of what metrics are actually defining the circularity in both social and environmental terms. And I think probably Sergio, Professor Sergio and his team would take an in-depth sort of view of a life cycle approach in the next session. So I would leave it to them. Then resilience to what? So there are two different kind of stresses and shocks. One is a long-term resilience that we are talking about. Another is a short-term. Yeah, so ability to come back to its original state, or at least to transform in a better way to handle the shocks. So let's look at the stress level. So what are the stresses that we are looking at? So the pressures or the tensions exerted on the system, and this is a long-term thing. So the demography changes, which is happening, the population changes, which is happening, cultural and social norms, natural resource degradation. It has been happening over the last few years, and it will still continue if we don't do like things differently now. Climate change, urbanization. Every day we are populating around 225,000 people, out of which 1% is moving towards urban areas. Automation, again looking into the different sort of technology that is that's an outcome of automation, and science and technology that sits between both stress and the shock. So sometimes there could be a disruptive technology, and sometimes it could be a disruptive science discoveries as well. Geopolitics, again, it could be sitting into the stress and the shock level. So shock, coming to the shock, sudden surprising event which is affecting the system, such as trade wars, election, referendum results, and we all know what's happening in today's world in the UK. So food scares, again extreme weather events, so all of a sudden rainfall, all of a sudden drought, and that again that directly impacts the food availability, food production, conflicts at different level, humanitarian level, conflicts between different nations, geophysical events. So again, when we talk in terms of resilience, again the question is to what, and it would be stresses and the shocks that we are looking to be resilient to. For whom? Different supply chain actors, different food system actors. So within the supply chain, again, it's the input industry. And when we talk about input industry, there are the different fertilizers, the chemicals, the different nursery providers, seed providers, and farmers, fishermen, traders, processors, manufacturers, food industry, retailers, food service, subsistence farmers, consumers, waste process, sewage, so everybody who manages them, and also, like, noting that they are influenced by a range of drivers, and those drivers could be the policy, economic, social, environmental, science and technology driven, and all of the stakeholders have a range of motives. So it is very important to understand the different views and the different perspective of multi-stakeholders, because there would be very different opinions coming from the different directions. So it's good to capture them. Then resilience over what time period? So short-term interruptions, usually due to shocks, example, fishing or agricultural activities, critical ingredient shortfall, just-in-time grocery deliveries, consumer shopping patterns due to food scarce, long-term disruptions, and that usually happens because of the stresses, so natural resource degradation, energy price, low carbon emission regulations, changes in the dietary preferences. So this is again talking about the scope. So what scope you are going to work on, that is important to start thinking about, and then it comes to the geography and the culture. So where you are actually working. Now I was going to put a Mentimeter here, but then I did not have time. So I was thinking that Greece is just 1 hour ahead. So I don't have Mentimeter here to play around with you. But this is just to put you in context, different geography and culture would also impact the understanding of the research. For example, if it is a developed nations, one of the developed nations, and I'm not going to name it, here we are talking about obesity. Okay, so it's the overconsumption of the food, and other developing nations where we are talking about the malnutrition. So what is the context that we are capturing? What is the main research problem that we are looking at? Is it both? Is it one of them? So today, in today's era, we are sitting in between obesity, obesity on one hand and malnutrition on the other hand. So it's food insecurity at both the ends. Then again, looking into the geographical infrastructure differences. So for example, if we are understanding about, if we try and understand about the cold storages and the warehouses, we would imagine a proper sort of buildings like this, but in many instances, they are just open fields, and especially in the developing countries, there are no much infrastructure especially for the fresh fruits and vegetables. Again, when we talk about the reefer trucks, we really imagine very closed temperature controlled trucks and transportation happening from the farms to the retail level, and a very integrated cold chain But in many of the instances, and especially in the developing countries, sometimes, not sometimes, actually most of the times, it's the open truck, yeah. And many of the times in the open trucks, you would see even people sitting on the produce. So you can imagine, like, when people are sitting, especially on the leafy greens, and here you can see the leafy greens, the handling and the longevity of the produce is automatically reduced. So just to give you a comparative analysis of what happens in the different geographic context and different country contexts, 4% of India's perishable is transported by cold chain, whereas in the UK it's 90%. Okay, and in India, almost 97% of the produce is eaten fresh. Less than 1% is processed. So we also waste in India. There is around 40 to 50% wastage in the fresh food supply chain. So you can imagine 40 to 50% wasted in the fresh food supply chain. Less than 1% is being processed. How much opportunity is there which is still not being utilized? So again, understanding the geographical context, the infrastructure differences is important. There is no end-to-end cold chain. So first and the last mile connection infrastructure is not there in most of the developing countries, not just in India, but in most of the developing countries, unlike in the developed countries where we have end-to-end connections. Temperature shocks happen because you can imagine if the produce is taken out from the farm, it's nice and fresh, but if it is transported in like 35 to 45 degrees temperature without any reefer trucks, in open trucks, and then it reaches to the retail where they are again given a temperature of around 20 to sometimes 25. Very rarely I've seen, like, these being maintained under 15 degrees centigrade. So again, the deterioration happens very fast. And in terms of cold storages, again, there are very, very less cold storages in the developing countries, and I just have the data from my recent visit in India. The cold storages needed are like more than 20,000, but we only have like 7,000 something in the cold storage, and almost like 75% of those cold storages are utilized by potatoes. So we have been operating like this since British left us. So because obviously they loved potatoes, so we have been storing potatoes for quite some time, and we are still storing potatoes in those cold storages. 60% of these are in only 2 states. So most of the other parts of India are lacking a lot of cold storage facilities. And again, it's not just about the country's difference, but even within the same country, there could be a lot of regional differences. So again, capturing that, it depends, what the scope of the study is. So for example, there are different price discovery mechanism. Let's say in the UK, most of the time it is a contractual farming, and the prices are set and they are reviewed every year. So on an annual basis, and mostly the prices are set for at least 1 year time, with very less possibility of fluctuation. But in many of the developing countries, the prices are set on a daily basis. And most of the time, what happens is outcry by traders. So the traders, they accompany in one particular area, which is like an open market yard, and they shout out the prices, and based on the produce they have, and then sometimes it is under the handkerchief as well. So the prices are set under the handkerchief, and then the prices are released on the board for the market. So it's a very, very different approach of pricing. There are sometimes e-auction platform, but even the e-auction platforms are liaising with these traders and then releasing their prices on their platform. Now, very recently, government of India, and I don't know what's happening in other countries in Africa, but very recently, government of India, they have tried and intervened this price negotiation practices. So, for example, whatever price the market sets, it gives they would set maybe 10% higher price for the farmers market. So farmers, instead of going directly to the open yards, they could go to the nearby local farmer market, and they could work on the price set up by the government. So there are different pricing mechanisms. That's what I'm trying to say. And it's not just like country-wise differences, but sometimes within the country there could be the regional differences as well. So again, understanding the regional context, the country context, the geography context, the cultural differences is very important when you are considering the project, when you are considering the research on the agri-food. Okay, now the second is the third one is understanding the context of the process. So what process we are investigating and what product we are investigating. So again, having a thorough understanding of the process is very important, and this has been taken from one of my very recent research. We are still in the process of completing it. Hopefully in the next couple of months we should be able to finish this project. This is being done in the UK in collaboration with policymakers such as FSA, Food Standard Agency, which are the food inspectors in the UK, and also DEFRA and APHA, which is Animal and Plant Health Agency. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand here the meat industry and the traceability in the meat industry, how the different processes work, the food safety aspect, the inspection process which is happening, and it is very, very invasive at the moment. So before we go out and give out some suggestions, it is important for us to actually map the whole processes. We do this by 3-4 ways, and I would cover that in the research approach and the research methods part. But what we did here, we did a series of interviews, focus groups, observation, Gemba walk. So we recorded and a very detailed Gemba walk. So we recorded different timings of the processes, what's being done, what's being missed out. So for example, number one, and I don't know if you could see that in let me just try and enlarge this, just this slide. Are you able to see the full slide, this one?
No, we just see the screen.
Okay.
That's fine. That's big enough. So
Okay.
it's a problem because we are projecting it. So
Okay, that's fine.
yeah.
Okay, so what we did here, we understood the different processes. So from the stunning to the bleeding to the, so it's ante-mortem inspection, which happens before the animal is dead or slaughtered, to the post-mortem inspection, which happens after the animal is slaughtered. So looking into the internal organs and all. And I'm sorry that I'm going through this processes in detail, but I'm sure many of you sitting there would be part of this consumption. So it's important to understand the food safety aspect. And what we found was, like, there's a lot of visual checks which is happening. It is very invasive. All the data which is flowing from one end to the another end is very disconnected. They are mostly paper based, even in the UK. Forget about the developing countries. So it's a lot of paper records, a lot of system entries. So the flow of data across the inspection process is not really joined up. The different agencies are not really working together. So again, understanding it from the different agencies' context is also very important. And So all the processes ahead of unloading and after chilling are assessed by one set of official. Then the other set of official would be feeding it back to the system. So there would be another checks done at the farm level, which is done by other set of agencies, and that's DEFRA. Then they feed, then the FSA, they do the checks at the abattoir level. Then they feed back to the health sector, which are like APHA, Animal and Plant Health Agency, and the local agencies as well, which are again maintaining the different data, but then those data are not really creating a lot of intelligence. So they are just sitting, hanging around there, but not creating a lot of intelligence. And again, a lot of waste happens in all these different processes. So I'm sure in your next session, you would be understanding a little bit more about linear circular economy model and the network circular economy model. So basically the waste happens at each and every stage of the supply chain, and how do you make the circle so small so that it is absorbed within the system, and we are moving towards a zero carbon economy system. So that is, again, it's a very controversial issue, especially when it comes to the meat sector, but we are working on it. There are different ways that we could look into the circularity in the meat industry. And again, it's very labor intensive. Things are not looking great, especially after Brexit. So we are again looking into what are the different sort of technologies and the data that needs to be incorporated within the system, so that the system could be upgraded from almost 18th century Victorian time to a 21st century time. So this is, again, it's very important to understand what processes we are working on and what product we are working on, because things would differ when the product is different, and especially whether it is a seasonal product or whether it is all through the year-round product. So for example, when we come to the wedges, there could be, again, some produce which are just produced at one season, and it's kept all the year long. So for example, it could be potatoes or onions that is produced in certain season, and they are stored for longer time. There would be other produce such as or even apples, for example, and apples is a very classic example. And this particular diagram, it's mostly from the harvest to the time of ripening, deconsolidated, retail, consumer level, going all the way through the cold chain infrastructure. This is mostly done on Apple. But when it is, let's say, tomatoes, things could be very different, because tomatoes are produced all the year round, especially in India and different countries in Africa as well. So managing that would be very different to how you would manage apple or onions or potatoes. Okay. So again, so that's why process and product both are important to understand. And finally, ethics, very important. Now, we have been working on ethics for quite some time, and I was a research ethics reviewer as well for about 5 years. What we did not realize is, like, one size doesn't fit all. So it depends which country you are working on and what country you are doing the research on. Or research with. So written consent versus oral consent, that is something that you might need to decide based on the geography, the culture, the language, the type of stakeholders, and even the educational background of stakeholders. So for example, when I work in the UK, I mostly take written consent, from most of the stakeholders, right from the farmers to the processors, manufacturers, and the retailers. But when I'm working in other countries such as Southeast Asia, Thailand, India, I am mostly taking oral consent. Now, when you take oral consent, you generally take it at least with one or two extra researcher with you or the interpreter with you. It depends if you need an interpreter or not. And you could record the oral consent, or you could simply write the oral consent, because it is important to understand the regional context, the geography context, and the mindset of the stakeholders. So, for instance, many of the farmers in most of the developing countries, they are not literate. Yeah, and when you ask them to sign certain papers, there is a lot of resentment, and you lose the plot then and there. So instead of progressing ahead with the research, we end up in different sort of arguments, and then the explanations and all those things. So just to avoid that, and also to give them the confidence that this research is like, you know, it's not something that is going to harm them. So just giving them a little bit of a background of the research orally, like, because obviously they don't know to read and write, and explaining them the whole process, and then asking them towards the end that, is it okay if we are writing your views, or we are recording what you are saying, because then we need the interpreter to transcribe. So I think that's a very good approach to go ahead with. And now coming to different research approaches and methods, and I won't be going into the details, because I'm sure you all know a lot about the different research approaches and methods, but just placing that in terms of agri-food supply chain research, how that would work, and how I have been doing research, and what's the latest new trends that we could be looking ahead. So I would cover that. Now, before research approach and the methods, I think everybody would generally start with a comprehensive literature review. I think it's a very, very good practice to have a clear understanding about the research gaps. And I think for the literature review, you could take 2 or 3 different approaches. You could either go critical literature review or systematic literature review. Now, it depends when you go for systematic literature review. For instance, if there is not much research in the area, or in the context in which you are trying to do the research, then there is no point in going ahead and doing a systematic literature review. It only makes sense when there has been research done, a wide amount of research, a good amount of research done in that particular topic, and you have enough papers to actually do a systematic literature review. And generally, most of the systematic literature review which I've seen is at least more than 50 papers they have taken to do a systematic literature review. Otherwise, you could also go for a critical literature review and still present a comprehensive literature review. I think it's very important to understand the keywords that you use in the literature review search, because all the different strings of keywords that you apply is going to give you different papers. And it's not just a one database that you should be using, but at least 3 to 4 different databases that you could use. And in a recent research, again, I think a combination of academic literature and the grey literature has also been appreciated. I think there are quite a few papers in International Journal of Management Research which have really encouraged combined approach. So I think it's good to start with the academic literature review, but especially when you are working in terms of circular economy, there are a lot of industrial reports, a lot of NGO reports, European Commission reports. I think even different policy reports that you could be looking at and getting the perspective, getting the holistic view. I think you all know this deductive, 2 different approaches, but it could be a combination of these two approaches as well. So deductive research approach and inductive research approach. So testing the validity of assumptions, theories, hypotheses. If you're doing that, if you are moving from general to specific approach, then it is a deductive approach. Inductive, you generally begin with specific observations, you identify the patterns, you develop the theory. So from specific, you move to the general, to generalization. Then research methods, and again, I think you most of you already know this, but I'll just give you a little bit examples on what I've been doing very recently. So research methods, quantitative, qualitative, mixed. Quantitative, it could be quite mostly it's a questionnaire survey, mostly it is close-ended questions. Experiments, I don't think so we do much experiments in supply chain, but it's generally quantitative, followed by questionnaire surveys, followed by statistical analysis and interpretation. Then qualitative, now most of my research, it falls under this qualitative research, and very recently I've tried and used participatory approach, which is kind of mixed, but again mostly qualitative. So qualitative interviews, mostly open-ended, but it could be semi-structured where you could have both open-ended and close-ended questions. Focus group discussions, case studies, observations, and document data. Again, in terms of document data, you use different approaches. It could be critical discourse analysis that you use, like few documents, and go really in depth into what are the different perspectives coming from documents from ABCD different organizations, or you could take a much wider approach of content analysis or thematic content analysis. Yeah, audio visual data and grounded theory. Mostly here, text and image analysis, so themes and pattern interpretations are done in qualitative. Mix is again you mix of both the open-ended questions, close-ended questions, surveys, combination with the different qualitative research. Participatory, now this is comparatively new in supply chain research. It has been done widely in other social science research, especially in humanities and geography contexts. So I very recently used a few, actually, four different participatory methods, and I can just give you a few examples of them. So before we actually do any participatory methods, I think it's important to understand, like, where do we use it and when do we use it? So for instance, we could use it in the beginning of the research cycle. So example, exploratory scoping of key issues in the beginning of the research. So exploring those key issues when we are not knowing the context or when we are not knowing the geography. I think it's very, very, very good to have the different stakeholders' perspective and the views together. Then we could also use during the research cycle, example, consulting participants about the research and seeking their input. So again, going to and fro with your research outcomes, outputs, and looking into the different participants' perspective and again, correcting it or revising it. And towards the end of the research cycle as well, so discussing the findings with the participants, gathering the feedback as well towards the end. So we could use it at any stage of the research cycle. And so most of this has been taken from Chambers, and it's a very, very good book in 1997. So he has told about the different principles of participatory research. So from the close-ended, we move to the open-ended questions, and we keep our mind open as well. So it's not like we don't have any set agenda, although we can have a broad overview, but not all the questions are well defined towards the very beginning. And from measuring, we move to comparing. From individual, it's more towards the group approach. Verbal, it's more towards the visual approach. So from the higher to lower audiences, especially the stakeholders, is very important. So noting everything on the paper could be okay, but we could also work at the ground level. So I'll show you a little bit on that. And then from the reserve approach, it's more of a rapport building approach, extracting information, moving towards the empowering them. So that's what, like, having in the mind what's the main principle of participatory research before we move ahead and do it. I think it is important. Typical participatory methods are mapping exercises, so spatial mapping, so activities mapping, and this is something that I've done very recently. Modeling, again, and that's why it falls under the mixed method, and I'm not very good with modeling, but I know many people sitting there are. Temporal sequences, so seasonal calendars, especially when we are doing the research in terms of agri-food context, understanding the seasonal activity of the products and the processes is very important. So trend line, then also when we are dealing with multi-stakeholders, listing, sorting, ranking the priorities from their angle. And again, it could be very much qualitative to quantitative as well. So we could use multi-criteria decision analysis here, like AHP and fuzzy logic, and but I'm not very good with that, so I'm not going into the details, but I know that these approaches have been used by different researchers. Well-being grouping, wealth ranking, time use analysis, institutional or Venn diagrams, and again, Venn diagrams are quite good when you're doing the cause and effect analysis. Participatory GIS, and again, when you say participatory GIS, it is geotagging the activities. So even the participants, they could geotag their activities and send it to you. Participatory video, this is something that I'm very keen to learn. I have not yet used it, but we do have different trainings in Sheffield to understand participatory video approach. I think geography is very good in delivering this participatory video approach. So mapping exercise, for example, if you are, again, not sure if you can see the things in detail, but nevertheless, I'll give you the overview. So basically, you know, when you go out in the field, there is a whole community which is sometimes there are a whole community which are engaged in the different product cultivation and harvesting activities. So again, mapping them, mapping their farms, mapping the different activities at the farm level, and also it's not just let's say fruits or vegetables which are growing, but sometimes they could be growing the livestock together with the fruits and vegetables. So it is important to understand the grazing where it is happening, just to get a wider perspective about the environmental impact or the social impact, or how how they are interacting, how the different activities are interacting. So it's good to start with the mapping exercise. Then seasonal calendar, again, different cropping patterns. So from January to December, what are the different activities and the processes that happens? And most of the time, it's like, you know, in many of the developing countries, especially with the small and marginal farmers, which are producing around 85% of the produce in the world. So it's important to understand how they function. Because when 85% of the produce of the world is dependent on them, I think not just the large-scale farmers, which are going like mostly monocropping, it is also important to understand how the marginal and the small-scale farmers function. So most of the time, monocropping is not there in many of the parts of developing countries. So they move from one vegetable or one fruits to another. When do they move, and what timing do they move? Is the timing correct or not? And again, I think it is better to do this research in collaboration with other disciplines as well, to understand the holistic, to get a holistic perspective of the different processes and the activities that is happening on farm. Because when you are trying to understand again the circularity of the agri-food supply chain, I think it is very important to understand the different processes that happens in the farm, and when the different cropping patterns change, what sort of losses they make and why they make those losses. So again, using a seasonal calendar about the different crops, when the food is available, when the labor market is down, and when it is in the high demand and why it is in the high demand. I think having a both environmental and social context is important to, before we understand the circularity of the chain. Okay. Then again, Venn diagram, again, it is very good in terms of cause and effect, understanding what are the different causes of, let's say, here I've taken example from Chambers on a medical research, but let's say different causes of the food loss, which happens towards the beginning of the supply chain, and the different causes of the food waste, which happens towards the end of the supply chain. And the effect of that. And again, when you put it in the country context or the geography context, you would realize that most of the food loss and the waste happens in the upstream level in the supply chain in the developing countries, and most of the food waste happens towards the downstream in the developed countries. And again, it depends on the different causes. So for example, in the developing countries, the causes could be the lack of infrastructure, the causes could be the supply and demand gaps, and especially there is no connected supply chain. So I don't know if you remember this slide, where I don't think so I covered that, where I had put the interconnected system, a complex interconnected system, in bracket. But the reason why I put it in the bracket is in many of the developing countries, it's very broken and it is not connected at all. So again, it is like, it becomes very easy when you do some cause and effect sort of analysis to understand why the system is broken and where it is broken, what sort of effect it is having on the circularity, for instance, or on the food loss that is happening at the farm level, food waste which is happening beyond the farm level, so post farm. And again, what are the solutions, and who are the drivers of the solutions? So this Venn diagram could actually change to, when we are talking about the solution, we could also add who are the people who are responsible for these solutions. So again, with these circles, there could be other interlinked circles of the stakeholders which could come into picture to say who is responsible more for those sort of solutions at different stages of the supply chain. So again, this is something which is new, and I've just tried it in my recent visit. I'm still not published yet. But the other way to do the cause and effect analysis, it could be root cause analysis or the fishbone diagram that people often present, and that could be another good way of presenting it. Again, listing, sorting, ranking activities, and this is again done very qualitatively. So taking a multi-stakeholders approach, and asking them to list out the different sort of challenges. And this is again one of my other projects where we were studying the different challenges at the farm level, post-farm level, at towards the consumer end, and then we asked them to group together and finally put the ranking on it. Now, this could be followed up by a little bit more complex methodology, like AHP or different multi-criteria decision making processes, fuzzy logic or blacktopsis. There are different research out in the supply chain research, which could be used in agri-food supply chain, but I am just limiting itself towards the qualitative listing, sorting, and ranking approach. Okay. Understanding one or two agri-food research projects in detail. The next few slides which I'm going to show is from a very recently funded project, and it is a multidisciplinary approach. STFC Food Network Plus, for instance. Now, STFC, it stands for Science and Technology Facilities Council. It's one of the UK Research Council, UKRI now known as, and they would generally fund the research in space science, astrophysics, different physics-related disciplines, but very recently, we have tried and experimented it towards an interdisciplinary approach and how we could use some of those space science, data science technology that STFC has, and incorporate that to understand and address the food challenges, the food system challenges. And we have very conveniently broken down the food system into three different strands. One is at the production level, and from production to the consumption, we call it as a supply chain, although I consider supply chain from the production, from end to end, so from production to the consumers. But let's, for the simplicity, at the farm level, then beyond the farm level till up to the time it reaches to the consumers, and then consumer level. Then some of the capabilities that comes from the other disciplines which could be used in our supply chain research are big data science. Okay, so there is a very complicated data science that astronomy researchers are using, including remote sensing, including different sort of temperature sensing, thermography, that could be actually completely used to understand how the production system functions, and or the forecasting the yield of the produce, or the connecting the different data across the supply chain, because no matter where you go, whether it is the UK or in any other developing countries, the data chain is very much broken. Some of the data are being collected at some of the stages, but they are mostly in silos. They are not talking to each other. So how do we make a data-driven supply chain? And there again, capabilities coming from the data science people, especially working with the physics sector, it becomes very, very handy. The second one is about different technologies that space sciences use, whether it is related to sensing technology, IoT related devices, or whether it is related to thermal insulation. So for instance, many times the most like the key reason for the food loss and the waste would be temperature fluctuation, especially in the developing countries where the temperature is generally 40 to 45 degrees, and broken cold chain. Okay, and there is a broken cold chain. So how do we function there? Like, what are the different sort of materials? So again, different material scientists would come into picture, different materials, insulation materials that we could use to actually insulate the produce. And again, this fits very well in circular economy context, an interdisciplinary approach coming from different fields. They have been using these technologies in making of different instruments, space-related instruments, the satellites and all. which functions in very, very highly fluctuating temperature environment. So how do we make it a bit cheaper? Because it's the amount of precision that they use for the space science research is very high, but we don't need that much of precision and accuracy in when we are working on the food supply chain in this planet. So cheaper options could be available there in terms of technology. Different sort of technology, visualization technology, sensing technology, again, modeling different data together and presenting 3D visualizations. For example, digital twin. They use a lot of digital twin approach in aerospace research, in space science research, but rarely it has been used in understanding the consumer behavior, for instance, or the food supply chain actors, how they would behave when the things would change, when the process would change, when there is a technological disruptions there. So again, digital twin could be used to understand that. Different facilities of STFC in the UK. So, for example, unlike other research councils, they have a wide variety, or they have very, very big campus. Especially two of their campuses are quite big. One is near the Harwell, which gives you access to different instruments and facilities where you can go and play around with different X-rays machines, different sort of neutrons machine, which even X-rays could not penetrate, and that's very important when it comes to the food manufacturing. They really want to understand the microstructure of their produce and what is actually causing the shelf life damage. So it's important to study from that aspect as well. Now I'm not saying that you all should be a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary researcher, but I think it's important to understand that there are different disciplines which could contribute towards your research agenda as well, and then you can find out your way of contributing towards the interdisciplinary research. So for instance, within this whole research project, and this research project is now going ahead with 1.2 million for next 4 years, and I'm leading that starting in this February, but it has been producing different researchers since last 3 years, and one of the research that came from such network project was a project in India. So we came up with an idea of transforming cold food chain in India through space science and technology, and that we have called as a transition. You can find a little bit more information about transition in the website. What we did here, we took again some of the space science related research. We understood what are the different challenges that we want to focus on, and again, for the understanding different challenges, we used this ranking, listing, and sorting approach. And out of that, we just took two of the main challenge to go ahead with. One was the food productivity, so enhancing the food productivity, and also connecting farmers to the supply chain. And the second was reducing the food loss and the food waste across the supply chain, and what are the different sort of technologies that could be used in the research. So that's what the transition project is all about. And again, I don't think so I can present it in the full screen, but let me see if I can just show you around. Okay. So the main challenges in the agri-food supply chain that we focus there was food loss and the food waste. Almost 1/3 of the global food produce is lost. We all know this. Shelf life or the holding life is less than few hours to up to mostly 2 to 3 days at the max, especially when we are talking about the fresh produce. Now, this is again creating a loss of value and livelihood. So in total, 940 billion US dollars are lost every year. out of which $680 billion are lost in the global north and $310 billion are lost in the global south. And again, this cost differentiation is mostly related to, again, the pricing mechanism in both global north and south based on the income capabilities. Loss of resources, land degraded, fresh water wasted and polluted, energy and chemical input wasted. Nutrition loss is again another aspect of both food safety and food security. So nutrients is lost across the chain, food quality, unsustainable, unhealthy diet. And this presents a complex nexus of economic growth, resource demand, environmental sustainability, and public health. The different research methods that we have used in this project are being used in this project, because this project has just started like 3 months ago. We are taking interviews, and most of the interviews are walk-along interviews. So we are going to the field and we are taking interviews with the farmers, laborers, their traders, the supply chain partners, going and visiting their places and noting down a few aspects along with interviews. So observation is going hand in hand. Then focus group discussions, roundtable discussion. Again, focus group is with one set of stakeholders. Roundtable discussion, we have a mix of stakeholders where we are doing priority analysis as well. So if you look into just a few pictures, but I think we can skip given the time limit. We are doing quite a lot of interviews, but it's mostly in form of conversation with the different stakeholders in India. Whether they are laborers or farmers. So it is mostly walk along sort of interview. Again, we are taking a lot of observation data, how the farming practices are being done. So besides what they are saying, we are also taking a note of different observations data. And observation data related to transportation is very interesting. You can already see that it's not like a regular transport that you would imagine here in the UK. And again, that brings us back to the context, geographical context. So it's not like a full closed reefer trucks. Many times it is with the carts and several different people holding those carts as well. So this is again an open market yard data. People are very, free to stand on the produce as well. And sometimes not just one person, but quite a lot of, many times there are the community which is sitting on the produce which is just being harvested from the farm, and they are taking it to the near farmers market. But you can understand the handling practices is very, very different in India, and it's very much underdeveloped. Okay, now coming to the retail, again, there is a lot of grading that happens at the farm level, and especially we are doing this research in fresh greens and tomatoes. So there is a lot of grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and the grading happens at the farm level. Again, the grading happens at the collection center, grading happens at the distribution center. But then when it comes to the retails, everything is mixed. So ultimately, they are paid on the basis of different grades that they get. So grade 1 is paid a little 20% higher than grade 2. Grade 2 is paid 10% higher than grade 3. But then, when you come to the reality, you would imagine that since there has been so much of effort in grading, they should be taken care at the retail level, but situation is not that straightforward. And also the way they are keeping their produce, the temperature differences, and especially this is important from physics angle. as well to understand the different temperatures and what impact it has on the shelf life. So for example, you can see here potatoes, potatoes, onions, and tomatoes, they are all kept in the same sort of temperature. However, they are very different produce, and ideally there should be a temperature differentiation. I mean, this is nothing, I don't think I had time to put another picture. It was even more interesting, where tomatoes and greens were kept just beside coconuts. So you can imagine that similar sort of temperature are being used for multiple different produce, which is not helping them in maintaining the shelf life. And not just in India, but we have recently completed a research project with one of the retailers in the UK on their banana supply chain. And again, they wanted to know the root cause analysis of the banana loss at the retail. But again, the temperature plays a very crucial role when it comes to banana supply chain, because banana is actually maintained in 12 to 14 degrees centigrade. Optimally, like that's the optimum temperature that they should be maintaining it. But they were keeping bananas besides strawberries. So strawberries, which is being maintained at 4 degrees. So ultimately, it was their handling practices at the retail, and the placement was absolutely wrong. So there was nothing much wrong in the supply chain, but the retail itself. And again, here again, besides the bread, you can see a lot of greens. So you can imagine like why the shelf life completely deteriorates towards the end of the supply chain. So something which we are already in progress in preparing for the next stage is different risks and opportunities in agri-food supply chain. Different risk occurs at the production level, from the climate change to water availability, pest and diseases management, extreme weather patterns, post-harvest management techniques, knowledge, lack of infrastructure, lack of data connectivity. That's really, really important. And I think irrespective of the country context, you would find this lack of data connectivity and most of the data being on paper. So where does again an interdisciplinary research could help? We are using different types of big data science here. So actually understanding the cropping patterns, understanding when the harvesting could take place, facilitating it with staggered cropping patterns and staggered harvesting patterns is very, very important and helpful for the farmers there. So using the different data from remote sensing, so different satellite data, so the evolutionary satellite data are being used here. Beside evolutionary satellite data, there have maintained a lot of paper-based data at the farm level, which are being digitized now. And sometimes instead of just digitizing it from a paper to the Excel, you could use natural language processing, which is again coming from the different field, which could automatically digitize your paper data to basically Excel data. So this is something that we are experimenting on. Then again, lack of infrastructure. For the lack of infrastructure, we are taking help of different space thermal scientists, and space thermal insulation are being studied. So the different material analysis is being done. Different infrared thermography is being used, which means that without touching the produce, you could actually know the temperature leakages and the different temperatures. So so basically temperature of the produce within this basket could be known. The produce which are kept on the open ground, they could be known again. It's with the help of infrared thermography, and again it's mostly like a gun kind of instrument where you shoot it and you get the temperature reading. Digitization is something that we are working on. So not just in this particular project, but also in other projects where we were working on the different UK officials, especially in the meat supply chain. So digitization meaning converting the handwritten data to actually digitized form. Then looking into the market risk. So again, supply and demand gap is there. There is no visibility. Farmers don't know what the market price would be for next day, or what the demand of the produce would be for the next day. Very unorganized planning is there. There is no fixed contract. Even uneven share of risk is there. Most of the risk, we all know, is being shared by the weakest link. So again, understanding a business model where you could actually make a rational sharing of risk, that is also important. And rational distribution of value, that could be important as well. So again, here the big data science we are using, demand supply forecasting. For the demand forecasting, we are using different market data, so the historical market data, and with the help of IBM Research and STFC Hartree Center, which where the whole data scientists are sitting, we are aiming to actually combine the different types of big data to make sure that it gives us an intelligent answer towards what to grow and when to grow, and when to harvest. So that is again a very important aspect, because when the harvesting takes place, like when especially the neighborhood, or most of the neighborhoods, when they are growing tomatoes and all the harvesting takes place the same day, the price is reduced quite a lot. So again, staggered harvesting is again something that we are looking into. And digitalization. So digitalization is about the process digitalization that could be helpful here. Logistics risk, again, connectivity issue. You have already seen there has been a lot of logistic infrastructure is not there. Poor handling practices is there. Lack of know-how, lack of infrastructure. So again, here thermal insulation, cryogenics. Now this is something very new. Especially in the food supply chain research, they have been using liquid nitrogen in other sciencey research, but this is something that we are going to try on, a combination of actually traditional cooling method using diesel and gases with a hybrid approach of liquid nitrogen, which actually lowers the temperature much faster than the normal diesel would. And Internet of Things, so different sensors we would be implanting from the farm to the consumption center, and especially during the transportation. Traceability risk, food fraud, adulteration, food quality, hygiene issues, lack of standardization. It is a very, very important aspect because there is no standardization. Forget about the standards, but also the standardization of the processes is not there. Standardization of the warehouse is not there. Supply chain transparency, I mean, it's not new, is not there in developing countries, but I would also argue it's not there in the developed countries as well. So the transparency is still a major challenge when it comes to actually designing a circular supply chain, because if we don't have the data of how much is being wasted and what is being wasted and what is being utilized at the different level of the supply chain, it would be difficult to have a fully circular supply chain. And not just a circular supply chain, but I think we have to move maybe one step ahead of the circularity and think in terms of carbon negative, because if we are just roving around the circle, we wouldn't be carbon negative. And in order to actually achieve the target of 2050 of zero carbon, we have to be thinking in terms of how do we become a carbon negative economy now, so that we can be a zero carbon economy by 2040 or 2050. So again, different strategies and the practices needs to be actually incorporated along with the circular economy practices. Again, here digital supply chain. So this is something that we are working on: digitization, digitalization, and then towards the end it's a digital transformation. How do we achieve that? We are still working on that, and what are the different sort of drivers that would enable us to be at this digital transformation stage. That is, hopefully we should be able to answer this in the next few months of our research. So coming towards the end, okay, so key aspects of working with agri-food supply chain partners. I'm sure there would be many secondments in ProCEedS and also in retrace as well. I think there are few important points that I would like to share from my own experience, and I think there could be more from others around the room. So recognizing the context is very important. The scope of your study, the culture where it is based, geography where it is based, process and the product that we are capturing, and again it depends. And again, the ethics would depend on the geography and the culture. Language is also very important, especially when we are working with the different stakeholders. We should not be sounding as if we are working on them. Rather, we should be more focusing on working with them or for them. So I think it becomes very easier. The conversation becomes very easy when we try and work with them or for them. Rather than just be super academic research oriented and just needed and just you would just need the data from them and then that's it, over. So that wouldn't work, especially when you're trying to develop a relationship for the long-term research. Now, understanding and managing different stakeholders' interest and conflicts, again, that is very important. Managing different working styles, so the different stakeholders would be prioritizing the different way of working. So for example, you can't be asking farmers who are working day and night to actually come to a cafeteria and have a coffee and have an interview with yourself. So it could be that you have to go to their place, their farms, and to do a walk along sort of interview. Building trust with the partners is again very important, and again it takes time, but it would be developed over the time. Negotiating internal and external transparency, this is important as well. Now, time investment, return ratio initially could be very small, so beware of that. Now, include networking time in the project plan, so that is important as well. Identifying the leaders and the benchmarks, so what sort of industry you're working on, the product you're working on, again the geographical context you're working on, it would differ. So the benchmark that you have of a product based in country A might not be actually worth taking the same benchmark for country B. Okay, consider longer term sustainability, and I would really suggest from my experience, not just about the reading different papers and reading papers from the different disciplines, but interactions with multidisciplinary researchers and different stakeholders is equally important. Enhancing your knowledge through reading papers is absolutely imperative, but actually combining it with the interactions, the practical interactions with the multidisciplinary researchers and stakeholders is equally important. So yeah, that's it. I think I have maybe 9 minutes for a question. So thank you all for the attention. I think it has been too much of me speaking. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Sonal. And I think it has been an excellent presentation and providing a lot of food for thought to everybody. That's really the case to say that, given the topic of your presentation. And is there any question that somebody would like to ask to Sonal, also from our online attendees? Actually, we have quite a lot of people connected online, 10 people. online. That's very good attendance also for the online version of this webinar. Anybody who would like to ask questions? I have a question myself, but Panos.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. This is Panos Ketekidis from South European Research Center. Discussing about resilience, as you know very well, there is not a specific definition. Depends on what view you are seeing resilient. If you see it from the supply chain management, it's a different definition. If you see it from ecological, it's a different definition. If you see it from engineering, it's a different definition. So, can you tell us a little bit and share with us from the agri-food your experience up to now? How you define the resilience, and what are the challenges that we have to face? Because in food, as I know, I'm not expert on this, we have regular disruptions. Okay, so how we can recover, that is one of the things that they say, you know, for resilience. So you can tell us a little bit more about this. That would be very helpful for us.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you,
Pan.
Yeah, over to you, son.
Yeah, thanks, Pan.
I think we have lost you, Sonal. If you could.
Can you hear me now? Or
Yeah, now, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so I think it's probably my microphone sometimes playing around with me. But anyways, I think the resilience, especially which I covered, was food system resilience. And I think the basic question which I'm proposing all the researchers should be answering or asking is the same even in context, it will remain the same even in the context of agri-food supply chain. So what you want to be resilient of, to whom you want to be resilient, to what you want to be resilient to, and for whom you want to be resilient, and over the what time period. And when it comes to exact, taking a case study approach of agri-food supply chain, we are talking in terms of stresses and shocks. So the shocks sometimes could be presented in terms of the extreme weather, the uncertainty, events that happens. So for example, you can take like 2010 forest fires in Russia and Kazakhstan that impacted the wheat production. Yeah, and that happened because of the extreme temperature differences, like never before. So it created the forest fire, and that completely impacted the wheat production. It also impacted the wheat export to the UK, and I know some of the supply chain partners and the bread manufacturer that were impacted by that shock. So that is again the extreme weather event that I'm referring to. The second one, which I covered, was stress. So something like, you know, there is a limited land, and we all know this, and the same land is being used for manufacturing industries. The same land is being used for the food production, for housing, for commercialization, for commercial activities. So it is a very inelastic resource that we are operating in, with an elastic demand, and the elasticity comes from the population expansion that we are experiencing. So the demand of the food is high, the resources, the inelastic resources are low. So how do we again operate in a way that is actually going to address the stress of natural resource depletion? So that is again a second example of what we could work on in terms of the food supply chain, in terms of the stress and the shocks. Does that answer some of your question, or at least part of your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sonal. I think we've got time for one more quick question, because the meeting will be terminated strictly at noon by the online platform. Anybody would like to ask something else? I have a very quick question, Sonal, and related, to these perishability elements that you were talking about, and the appropriate storage of food that you were displaying in some of your slides, which I think it's a crucial point for making sure we extend the shelf life of products. Of course, in many countries, especially Southern European countries, there is a lot of resistance when it comes to implementing appropriate storage solution, display solution for food, because policymakers say, well, if we implement these, if we require all the stakeholders to implement these, this will kill SMEs, the local greengrocer who is selling fruit and vegetables. What's your perspective on this? I mean, does it mean that to be more circular, to be more environmentally friendly, we need to have more concentration in the market?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Andrea, for this question.
Again, we cannot hear you, Sonal.
Okay, I'm speaking with the same microphone throughout. I don't know what's happening in between.
That's fine now.
Okay, so again, I think it's a similar situation even in the developing countries and in the European countries. So here we are talking about the service providers. So some of the SMEs or the middlemen who are actually taking a different role in the supply chain and keeping most of the values with themselves. Changing their role in the supply chain is important, and helping them in transitioning their role towards a service provider, which can actually save the food rather than create a loss, food loss and the food waste, which is good for nobody, not even for the environment and not for the general public consumption. I think helping them understand this phenomena and the transition would be important. And especially what we are doing in our project is we are creating a demonstration sites. So we are actually going to demonstrate the different sort of management practices and the business models that could actually enable this transition. So hopefully when the demonstration takes place, it would be easier for policy to follow on. But at where we are standing, the food is a cheaper commodity, and we recognize this as a major challenge because we have not been increasing the food price for quite some time, and the expenditure that we are incurring at the moment on the food is very much less, and especially given that what we were doing in 40 years ago, around 40% of our expenditure was on food, compared to today's in the developing countries, it is even less than 10%. So change needs to happen at different stages with different stakeholders, and the perspective needs to change. Only then the system would change.
Thank you very much, Sonal. Any other question? I managed to extend the duration so it won't be terminated abruptly.
Yeah, because I was thinking that it's not like it's 10 o'clock here, so it would be terminated. So I was just speaking very fast.
So at least we can thank you properly, Sonal, for this beautiful presentation, which has referred to contemporary challenges and methods which can be utilized for addressing them. Of course, I mean, the session has been recorded and it will be accessible through the project website to the general public as well. So thank you very much, and I'm sure this will benefit all the project consortium and all the people who will be performing secondments as part of the network. Thank you very much, Sonal, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, so the program of the day, now we will have coffee break. We'll start again at 12:30 local time here in Thessaloniki with the first session from Remo Sant'Agata about life cycle assessment. So we'll meet again roughly in half an hour in a new section. You should have the link to join. Thank you very much.
This conference will now be recorded.